minutes after 10 o'clock, Mark Hillman sitting in for Mike Rosen on 850 KOA, talking about what else but President Obama's visit to Denver and, more importantly, his signing of the $787 billion, or more like $3.2 trillion economic stimulus package, and what that means both for our economy in the next year or two and for the economy, our children and grandchildren, for the next couple of decades as they pay off this debt. One of the analogies used to really rush this proposal through Congress and onto President Obama's desk. Remember, he had to have it by President's Day. And Congress would not allow its members to read a bill of more than 1,000 pages because they had to get it to him. So they rushed it through Thursday, actually, so that President Obama could then fly home to Chicago to spend the weekend and apparently come back to Washington today and finally get around to signing the bill on Tuesday. Now, why they couldn't have done that why they couldn't have delayed the vote so that members of Congress could have stuck around for an extra day and at least been able to flip through the 1,073-page bill is beyond me. But the rhetoric, the reason that we need to get this done, we were told, is because we are trying to avoid a catastrophe like the Great Depression. Brad Schiller has an excellent piece in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend. He's an economics professor at the University of Nevada, putting some context into where we are today compared to the Great Depression. In the last year, Brad Schiller writes, the U.S. economy shed 3.4 million jobs. It's a grim statistic for sure, but it represents just 2.2% of the labor force. From November 1981 to 1982, during the first years of President Reagan's presidency, 2.4 million jobs were lost. Fewer in number today, but the labor force was smaller. Those job losses totaled 2.2% of the labor force, the same as now. Job losses in the Great Depression were of an entirely different magnitude. In 1930, the economy shed 4.8% of the labor force. In 31, 6.5%. And then in 1932, another 7.1%. Jobs were being lost at double or triple the rate of 2008 and 9 or 1981, 1982. This was reflected in unemployment rates. The latest survey pegs U.S. unemployment at 7.6%. That's more than 3 percentage points below the 1982 peak of 10.8%, and not even a third of the peak in 1932. And remember, Roosevelt began passing the large parts of the New Deal in 1936. In 1932, unemployment peaked at 25.2%. You simply can't equate 7.6% unemployment with the Great Depression. Other economic statistics also dispel any analogy between today's economic woes and the Great Depression. Real gross domestic product rose in 2008. Let me say that again. Real GDP actually increased in 2008 despite a bad fourth quarter. The Congressional Budget Office projects a decline in GDP of 2% in 2009, which is comparable to 1982 when GDP contracted by 1.9%. But it is nothing like 1930 when GDP fell in 1 year by 9%. Not a reduction in the rate of growth, but an actual reduction in output of 9%. And then in 1931, it contracted by another 8%. And in 1932, GDP contracted by another 13%. Auto production last year declined by about 25%. That looks good compared to 1932 when production shriveled by 90%. The failure of a couple dozen banks in 2008 just doesn't compare to 10,000 bank failures in 1933 or even the 3,000-plus bank failures during the savings and loan collapse in 1987-88. Stockholders can take some solace from the fact that the recent stock market debacle doesn't come close to the 90% devaluation of the early 1930s. And yet, we are passing the biggest spending bill in U.S. history. Ross in Netherlands, welcome to 850 KOA.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Doing great. First, I wanted to tell you, even though I'd love to have you as our senator, I'm glad you're not running. You've got a new baby, and, I know your family well, and I think you're making the right decision.
Yeah, believe me, once I started telling people that was my decision, it certainly confirmed that it was the right one to make. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. And by the way, for those of you that don't know Ross Kaminsky, he's a solid economic conservative and an ardent blogger, and you can read what he writes at rossputin.com. So what do you think about this whole economic stimulus?
I think Gerald Ford said that a government big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take from you everything you have. And
who was it that said those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it? That's where we are.
That is where we are. And one thing I wanted to mention, Bob Beaupre and Michelle Malkin and a bunch of others, including me, will be down. We don't have the location yet. Tomorrow, I wouldn't exactly call it a protest, but more like trying to shine a little light on exactly what's going on here. If anyone wants to come down, if they go to youdon'tknowstimulus.com, they'll be putting up the details of where the event will be.
Cute play on words. And I have heard other rumblings that a potential protest might be organized. Not the typical protest of the left throwing things and calling people names, but letting people know that all of America is not on board with another $30,000 in debt per household.
That's for sure. One of the big mistakes that I have to admit, going into this election, I thought that the problems in the economy would keep the Democrats from being able to socialize everything. But, for example, I thought health care would be relatively safe because once people start hearing about the cost of what these guys really want to do with health care, the fact that we're in this bad recession would keep them from being able to do it. What I didn't anticipate was they'd create something called a stimulus and put everything in it, including socialized medicine, which is something people aren't talking about. But this stimulus bill creates a 15-person board that's supposed to look at various medical treatments and medicines. It looks like their goal is going to be to tell doctors what they can and can't do.
And in the long run, either through tax treatment or through reimbursement under Medicare and Medicaid, the doctors can even either play by the government's treatment rules or not get the tax treatment that they would otherwise be expecting. And I think that's right. That's one of the dangers. What happened, as Rahm Emanuel said, and this is an exact quote, but essentially he said, President Obama's chief of staff, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And at that point, money was no longer an object. It was all about what do we want to do to move our agenda forward, and after we do a few things that we can perhaps credibly claim have a stimulative effect on the economy, let's put our agenda in place so that we don't have to go through things like the slow death of 1,000 cuts that Bill and Hillary Clinton learned as they more methodically tried to push through their government takeover of health care in 93 and 94.
Well, yeah, and your quote of Emanuel is an exact quote. That's exactly what he said, and it's remarkable when you step back and you look at the big picture. You mentioned it earlier today where Obama said that all spending is stimulus. And if you think back just even in the campaign, they were preparing us for this with all the Democrats saying, well, at a time like this, we shouldn't worry about deficits. They started saying that 2 months ago. And that's just where this is all going. It's exactly as you said. It's about their agenda. And what I think will be interesting is, Mark, what's your over-under and how many months until they start telling us we need stimulus 2?
Oh, I would say somewhere between 9 and 18, because I definitely think that's going to happen because, as even the Congressional Budget Office recognizes, in the long run, this doesn't stimulate. And especially, it would be one thing if we were talking about building infrastructure, roads and bridges and things like that were already in the pipeline, but we're not. We're talking mostly about creating jobs for government bureaucrats and creating entitlements. That's the big problem, and why I think this stimulus is doomed to fail. And you're right. I think it will lead to another, and then we start going the route of Japan, which calls the 1990s its lost decade.
I just don't know what's going to stop all this, though. I think Republicans might pick up a few seats in the next election, but don't think it'll be enough to make any difference, especially with more talk of so many Republicans thinking about retiring.